The day it started, it felt almost ordinary. A sun that had the lazy warmth of late summer, the smell of cut hay coming from the east field, and the tractor radio faintly humming a country station as I finished patching a broken fence post. My farm had always been a place of work and refuge, a patchwork of fields, a narrow gravel lane, and a small stand of cottonwoods by the creek where the kids built a fort every summer. I'd lived there long enough to know the rhythms. The deliveries that came on Tuesdays, the neighbor kids who'd come begging for a ride in a hay wagon, the county inspector who liked to show up unannounced. So, when a shiny black SUV, the kind that looks like it was designed to be both a status symbol and a rolling insult, pulled up one afternoon and parked halfway across my access lane and half of my grass, I assumed it belonged to someone delivering something important or a visiting contractor who'd misjudged the entrance. I was wiping grease off my hands when she stepped out. Middle-aged, coiffed hair that had obviously been set in a style expensive enough to be a monthly commitment, sunglasses that screamed, "Do not approach unless you have a reason," and an air of entitlement that practically folded the world to fit her. She introduced herself, or rather announced herself, as Karen from the HOA 3 miles down the road. Though there is no HOA that covers my property, our land sits outside their coven of perfectly trimmed lawns and mandatory flower beds. She said she'd come to inspect, a word she pronounced like a license, and proceeded to tell me that people living nearby had complained about my outbuildings, my untidy equipment, and a rumored shed that apparently offended their aesthetic. I listened because farmers know how to listen. We also know how to ignore nonsense until it becomes a nuisance. Karen, however, didn't do the usual passive-aggressive HOA dance of polite letters and meeting requests. She marched her high-heeled boots across my drive, scuffed the gravel, and planted herself at the edge of my vegetable patch as if she owned the soil. Her confidence was aggressive, the kind that expects fences to be metaphysical rather than physical lines. When I told her, calmly and clearly, that she was on private property and would need to move her vehicle, she tootayed in a way that suggested I needed a lesson in neighborliness. She claimed that the lane was a community easement and that she had the right to park where she pleased. She produced a little laminated card with glossy logos and an HOA phone number, as though branding could transmogrify logic into law. She didn't ask for permission, she assumed compliance. People like that are the kind of weather you can't forecast. They arrive, they insist, and they take up more space than they paid for. I told her again, louder this time, that she needed to move the SUV. She put a hand to her chest and said, with dripping innocence, that she was only trying to help preserve rural charm, and that I should be honored to have someone doing them the courtesy of oversight. An hour later, after a conversation involving a politely worded demand to leave, which she ignored, a phone call to the non-existent HOA that turned out to be the number of a property management firm in the city, and my warning that I'd call the sheriff if she refused to move, Karen finally sauntered back to her car, muttering about entitled landowners and people who can't follow community norms. She revved the engine, adjusted her designer sunglasses, and, in what I still can't parse as either spite or sheer obliviousness, parked again, this time deeper into my property so that the bumper crossed the property line and the rear tires sank into the soft, recently irrigated strip beside the pasture. I called the sheriff then. They told me they'd send someone out to talk to her, but that until a formal trespass charge came in, their options were limited. Karen, sensing victory, sat in her vehicle and started making calls of her own. I walked the farm that evening with my dog, an old hound named Gus who understands the nuances of a human temper better than most humans do, and I felt the old anger settle like dust into the pit of my stomach. It wasn't just that she'd parked on my land, it was the way she'd assumed she had dominion, the way she'd smiled in a way that implied the rules applied to everyone else. Farmers keep grudges differently. We don't call lawyers as often as we call the long view. Still, the SUV blocked my access to a corner where I stored seed and equipment, and the tractor couldn't reach the north field without navigating around it. For a few days, the SUV joined the landscape, an ugly, increasingly familiar shadow, and Karen continued to make visits, each time more brazen. leaving unsanctioned flyers on my gate about community standards, photographing my outbuildings with the glee of someone collecting ammunition for future complaints, and once, while I mended a fence, leaning on my gate as though it were public property. The local gossip mill spun in her favor at first. Karen loved an audience. She'd parade through the grocery store 2 towns over, brandishing complaints like rare coins and asking neighbors if they'd noticed the eyesore next to our lane. Some curious souls came by to gawk. A couple of her HOA cronies even parked on my shoulder to read her flyers aloud. I tolerated the circus for a few days, letting them see they couldn't rattle me, but there's a limit to what you can put up with before action becomes a kind of duty. Late one night, after a particularly inflammatory letter from Karen accusing me of sabotage and blight, I sat on my porch under a sky loaded with stars and thought about lines. Literal property lines, yes, but also the invisible lines of respect and decency that keep neighbors from becoming enemies. Karen had crossed them all. She had turned a trivial parking dispute into an act of provocation because she enjoyed playing sheriff to a jurisdiction that didn't exist. I'm not the sort to escalate for sport, but neither am I someone to surrender my land to arrogance. So I went to bed with a plan forming not out of malice, but out of a stubborn determination to reclaim what was mine, to teach a lesson that wouldn't require lawyers or threats, but would instead make the point with clarity and finality. The next morning, I walked the lane with the county survey map in my hand, measured distances with a tape, and told Gus, aloud and to the wind, that sometimes a farm's language is action, not words. The seed of what came next was planted in frustration, watered by the absurdity of a woman who thought she could commandeer my land by force of will. What I didn't know then was how far the story would travel and how muddy a moral victory could become when you decide to meet entitlement with an equal measure of theater. Planning is an unglamorous part of farm life. It's where stubbornness meets practicality, and where ideas that feel righteous are tested against the cold arithmetic of soil, time, and the law. After the third day of Karen parking like a permanent fixture, and after the sheriff's deputy who finally stopped by shrugged and advised civil court, I realized that the usual routes, polite requests, official complaints, asking neighbors to intervene, were going to be slow or ineffective against someone who lived for small humiliations. So I set about assembling a plan that would minimize risk, avoid endangering people, and yet make the point unmistakably. The first step was research. I dug up county ordinances, easement documents, and the deed to my property. There was no community easement granting her the right to park. My land, specifically the strip where she'd parked, was deeded to me and not subject to any shared access agreement. That gave me legal cover to act in the civil sense, but I wanted an outcome that didn't involve lawyers because lawyers like to bill by the hour and drag things into courtrooms where truth becomes a champion of paper. The second step was logistics. The sun had baked the topsoil lately, but the recent irrigation had left a strip of ground softer than the rest, exactly the kind of soil that would hold an impression. It occurred to me that if a vehicle was left long enough in that spot, it might sink on its own, but I didn't want nature to be the agent. I wanted a decisive act that would reassert control without harming anyone. I began to take inventory of my tools and resources. On the farm, an excavator isn't exotic. It's a workhorse for digging pond channels and resetting fence posts. The old Komatsu had been sitting idle after I dug the last irrigation pond, and it had a hydraulic arm that could lift more than its owner's stubbornness. I checked the oil, greased the joints, and ran diagnostics until the diesel engine coughed and warmed. I walked the perimeter where Karen's SUV was parked with a clipboard and drew a map of the angles, the slopes, and the access points so that if I had to move the car deliberately, I'd do it cleanly. I rang up an old friend, Pete, who owed me favors from the days when we swapped parts and labor for bottles of home-smoked brisket. Pete drove over, and we drank coffee while he listened to the whole story, Karen's arrogance, the HOA card, the sheriff's shrug. Pete is a pragmatist. He didn't laugh. He didn't moralize. He simply said, if you're going to make a point, do it so folks remember it. His eyes twinkled with a kind of mischief, like a man who appreciates the ingenuity of a well-executed plan. We agreed on rules. No damage to anything of sentimental or real value beyond the offending car, no physical confrontation with Karen or bystanders, and a commitment to keep it quick so the spectacle didn't draw unnecessary danger. We also decided on timing. Doing anything during daylight would invite onlookers, cameras, and potential legal witnesses. Doing it at night would be theatrical, but callous. We chose the gray pre-dawn hours, the kind of time when even the roosters are indecisive, because it would reduce the likelihood of passerby interference while keeping the moral center intact. I prepared a short written note to leave on Karen's windshield explaining why her car was where it was and that it would be repaired and released only after she acknowledged trespassing, a small courtesy intended to keep the moral argument clear and public. The next day, I called a tow operator to confirm towing procedures and salvage rules. I wanted to avoid violating statutes about abandoning vehicles. The plan wasn't to vandalize, it was to immobilize, to sink the vehicle in a way that would be reversible with the right paperwork and payment, but would make the point private property is private. There was also the question of witnesses. I chose to tell my wife and 3 trusted neighbors what I was doing. Secrets on a farm are like seeds. They grow and spread whether you want them to or not. And I didn't want anyone to be surprised and misinterpret events. My wife, practical as ever, offered me a flannel shirt and a steady look that said, "Don't make it worse by making it cruel." That was a restraint I welcomed. On the evening before the operation, I went over the plan with Pete one last time as thunderstorms rumbled on the horizon, and the smell of rain made the dirt smell alive. We timed the maneuver so the excavator would only move the tires, digging a trench that would gently cradle the rear end of the SUV, making it unlikely the engine would be started without committing to the sunk cost of getting it out. We also decided to place protective boards under the excavator tracks to avoid tearing up the lane more than necessary. A farm is a finite resource, and I didn't want to leave it a mud map of revenge. I rehearsed mental contingencies. If Karen confronted us, we'd step back and call the sheriff. If cameras recorded us, we'd be ready to explain the circumstances. If the parking spot was occupied by someone else, we'd postpone. Nothing about it was impulsive, it was calculated, and there was an odd satisfaction in the craftsmanship of a plan that required more thought than violence. As the sky darkened and the stars pricked the air with indifferent light, the farm took on the hush of waiting. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from a living sense of justice mixed with uncertainty. It's one thing to stand up for your property in the abstract, another to physically alter someone's possessions. I thought about whether my action would degrade my own standing, whether I'd become the sort of person who retaliates rather than reasons, and concluded that what I was resisting wasn't a person alone, but a behavior that rewarded entitlement. In the quiet that night, I wrote a short note to tuck into Karen's SUV's glove compartment after the fact. A copy of the deed showing my ownership of the land, a photocopy of the county ordinance regarding trespass, and an invitation to come and talk like an adult if she wanted restitution rather than drama. It was a small, almost gentlemanly gesture in an otherwise theatrical plan, and it kept the moral spine of the operation intact. There was no joy in the logistics, only a grim satisfaction in preparing a nonviolent, proportionate response that would leave a mark but not break lives. In the end, the plan felt less like revenge and more like a reclamation of a lane of dignity and of the quiet rule that places are for those who tend them, not for those who posture about them. The pre-dawn was a cold, copper-tinged hush, the sky a steel bowl over the fields, and the farm smelled of wet earth and diesel as we rolled the excavator out of the shed. Pete and I moved like 2 men in a trench of purpose, our movements economical, our faces under the brim of caps, the machine grumbling awake like a beast that knows the drill. We parked the excavator at a respectful distance from Karen's SUV, taking care to avoid any impression that we were staging a hostile act. The machine's arm extended under my practiced hand, and the bucket scraped the dirt with a sound that somehow made the whole farm feel like a courtroom settling to attention. We worked slowly, like surgeons, not seeking to wreck anything but to reposition a vehicle and the narrative attached to it. The plan required that we not touch any glass, not scratch a meter of paint unnecessarily. The intent was immobilization, not destruction. I eased the bucket toward the ground in an arc that would cradle the rear tires, not crush them, and began to remove soil in a shallow, measured trench. The tires burrowed with every scoop, and as the SUV's rear settled, the vehicle sank forward into the soft earth at an angle that made its owner's arrogance appear visibly humbled. It was at that moment, the delicate point where theater becomes actual consequence, that the world seemed to hold its breath. The rooster in the henhouse hesitated mid-crow. The creek, usually busy with its chatter, seemed to listen, and even the dogs that had slept through most of our planning lifted their heads. We worked with a solemnity that was almost ceremonial, the slow, steady rhythm of the hydraulic pumps like a heartbeat measuring the distance between entitlement and responsibility. I left a note on the windshield in a Ziploc bag, clear and concise. Property line attached, trespass, call X number to resolve. The note was a statement, not a taunt. By the time we finished, the SUV was nestled in a shallow pit, its rear tires cradled and immobilized. The visual effect satisfied an old part of my brain that likes symmetry. The car that had parked like it owned the lane now looked awkward and defeated, its glossy arrogance grounded in mud. We cleaned our tracks as best we could, raked the disturbed soil, and left the boards under the excavator to restore the lane's surface. I stayed on the porch with Gus while the light crept up like a slow curtain, watching the lane and waiting for the inevitable spectacle. Karen's shadow emerged first as a figure at the edge of the lane, then as her silhouette in the driver's seat, her posture stiff with indignation. She saw the SUV's rear sunk, and her face went through a slow, comical choreography. Surprise, denial, fury. A quick pivot to calling someone. She dialed a number like a conductor summoning an orchestra of outrage, and the HOA's voices came on the line, hushed high-strung, outraged on principle. Photos were taken, accusations were launched. She shouted words I won't repeat because they're more embarrassing than dangerous. Bystanders from the next road over-ambled toward the scene, drawn by the kind of curiosity that powers small-town economies. I went out to meet them, not to gloat, but to explain. I showed the deed, the map, and the documentation that left no legal doubt about the fact that the lane at issue, while used by some, was not an easement open to the HOA to command parking. I also said aloud what I'd hoped would be the moral of the story. If you cross someone's boundary with arrogance, expect that boundary to be enforced, and if you do it with a smile, don't be surprised if the response is theatrical. Karen wailed about humiliation and vowed to sue. She used the word vandalism like it was a shield. The sheriff arrived, 2 deputies, coffee cups in hand, looking like men who'd rather be anywhere else, and listened to both sides with an evenness that, after a lifetime of county calls, I respect. Once they saw the deed and the note, they admonished that I should have gone to court rather than take matters into my own hands. That was their duty. I heard it and understood it. But an admonition isn't an arrest, and after the deputies took statements, they left the scene with the kind of pragmatism I'd learned to accept. Sometimes the law is a slow plow that turns soil over with time, and sometimes you have to seed your point while it grows. The day lit up into a flurry of calls and social media posts. Karen's friends posted angry pictures of the sunk car like trophies, others posted the deed I'd shown, and suddenly the court of public opinion had a jury of strangers. There were those who applauded my audacity, a chorus in the comment threads that called it poetic justice, others condemned it as petty and criminal. The farm caught the attention of a local reporter who drove out to take pictures and ask questions. He called it a standoff between neighborly norms and private property rights, which sounded more noble than the simple truth. A woman parked where she shouldn't, and a man who tended the land responded in kind. A lawyer representing Karen threatened civil action. A letter with legalese, the kind of thing lawyers write to make clients feel protected. I read it with the bored interest of someone who has signed barn leases and banking documents. The lawyer's letter was long on righteous phrasing and short on legal footing. The town humored the spectacle for a while, but Life on a farm is noisy with real responsibilities, irrigation schedules, market deliveries, a herd that doesn't care about internet outrage. I went about the chores as if nothing had happened and watched the SUV become a weather vane for local sentiment. A funny thing occurred over the next week. People who had once avoided me because of the perceived difficulty of farm life, the driveway, the dust, the smell, began to stop by with a loaf of bread, a joke, or an offer to help move hay. Farmers have a shorthand for gratitude. It's the sharing of work and the swapping of labor. There was also a steady trickle of curious strangers who came to see the scene. And while I didn't solicit attention, I didn't discourage the truth either. The pit became a symbol, a small, muddy exclamation point. You cannot treat the land as an open stage for your self-importance and not expect an answer. Karen, in the end, learned something about consequences. Her SUV sat immobile and marshaled a new respect for the physical limits of her actions. Did I feel guilty? A little for the spectacle. Did I feel vindicated? Yes, because it recentered a boundary that had been mocked. In the quiet after the storm of attention, I realized that I had done something that would echo beyond the immediate incident, an assertion that private property and civility mean more than curated social standing, and that alone changed how neighbors looked at the farm and inevitably at me. The legal aftermath crept in like fog. Official letters, the occasional screaming voicemail from a local activist who had taken Karen's side, and the predictable court summons that said some questions were better answered in a judge's chamber than in a farmer's field. I hired counsel not because I wanted to fight, but because a lawyer smooths the chaos of formal processes the way a tiller readies ground for planting. My attorney, a woman who grew up on a neighboring farm and had a stubborn moral clarity I admired, told me to prepare every document, every photograph, every dated phone log that could prove the timeline. She told me, with the bluntness of someone who spent time in municipal courtrooms, that the law loves paper and hates theatrics. That was fair. I had the deed, the sheriff's statement, and even the tow operator's note about procedures. Karen's lawyer filed a civil claim alleging willful damage and punitive action. It was the sort of claim designed to intimidate, to make the thought of litigation heavier than the point being argued. I filed a counterclaim for trespass and sought a declaratory judgment that my property had been infringed upon. The hearings were procedural, strangely perfunctory affairs where words like egregious and intimidation were lobbed like softballs across a table under fluorescent lights. The judge, who had the look of someone fed up with neighborly petty disputes, asked pointed questions. Had I warned Karen? Had I offered to move the vehicle? Had she been given reasonable notice? I answered truthfully, I had done all those things. The judge's demeanor softened when he heard that Karen had parked repeatedly despite being told to move, and that her visits were escalating into what several of my neighbors described as harassment. Legal battles wear people down, not because the stakes are always high, but because they demand attention that could be otherwise spent harvesting or mending or teaching your kids to drive a tractor. Still, the court is a leveling place where documentation matters more than volume, and my stack of evidence made an argument that couldn't easily be laughed off. The court issued a ruling that, in essence, acknowledged my right to the land and admonished Karen for trespass while noting that my method of removal was reckless, albeit not criminal under the circumstances. The county required that I pay for the towing and temporary storage of the vehicle until Karen paid a fee, and she begrudgingly and under public humiliation arranged for its retrieval and vowed to never again treat her neighbors like props at a suburban theater. The ruling was a compromise, a legal shrug toward restoration rather than retribution. In the months that followed, the farm returned to its usual rhythm. Crops turned up, shipments were made, and the dogs resumed their old, lazy routines. Yet, beneath the surface, something had shifted in the community. Karen's social capital evaporated faster than pond water in August. Her invitations to book club and HOA dinners dwindled as people decided that the cost of association with someone who'd made such a spectacle was too high. Neighbors who once nodded politely now stopped for a chat. Some apologized for not having stood up sooner. The event had, unexpectedly, become a kind of community test, a benchmark by which people measured their own notions of neighborliness. I had never sought that role, but once thrust upon me, I accepted the responsibility with the same pragmatism I applied to my fields. There were also quieter consequences. A new lane marker was installed, a small stone post with my name engraved on it, an official reminder to future visitors that this lane belonged to someone who tended it. Children in the area learned the story as a kind of morality tale. Don't presume upon someone else's property, and certainly don't expect an audience to applaud when you try. I sometimes think about the ethical question of proportionality. Was sinking the car the only option? Could I have let the law take its slow procedural path and been proved right later? Probably. But sometimes rights are only meaningful when someone is willing to assert them in ways that are visible. The public nature of my response made the argument vivid. It turned a private irritation into a public cautionary tale. It's worth noting that the event also taught me empathy in odd ways. Karen, when I finally spoke to her, not in the heat of a confrontation, but in a quiet meeting arranged by the county mediator, we had a conversation stripped of branding and outrage. She confessed that she felt her identity was tied up in being the one who maintained standards, that volunteering for the HOA and policing others had given her a sense of worth she feared losing. It was, to be honest, both pathetic and revealing. Her posture of power was a brittle thing over a fragile core. We didn't become friends. That wasn't the point. But the conversation peeled back the hard edges of the story and reminded me that most human conflicts are built on fear as much as on principle. After the settlement, which involved Karen paying for the towing and signing an affidavit that she would cease trespassing, I fixed a lane where weed worked, smoothed the tire impressions, planted a small hedgerow as a visual boundary, and put up a simple sign, "Private lane, please respect property." I also left a copy of the mediator's note in the glove compartment of her SUV when it was returned, a short letter reminding her of the agreement. People asked if I regretted how public it all became. I said I didn't. Sometimes a demonstration is necessary to change the cost calculus for others. The farm, after all, is a school of hard pragmatism. It teaches you that people will test your limits and that your job is to set them reasonable and firm. I slept better after the hedgerow went in. The small boundary felt like a tooth pulled, a moment of pain that left you better, and the next season, when the crops came in thick and heavy, the lane held. Cars came and went properly, and the neighbors who once watched for theater found other things to do. In the end, the story became less about revenge and more about stewardship, protecting the space you tend, the dignity you cultivate, and the quiet rules that make communal life possible. Stories like mine tend to grow teeth as they circulate, details sharpened, motives simplified, and the moral twisted into a template for memes. But the quieter truth of property disputes is a mix of human frailty and practical necessity. Months after Karen's SUV was retrieved and her name faded from the front pages of local feeds, life on the farm resumed its patient work. Fences mended, cattle sorted, irrigation ditches dug and redug when the rains were fickle. The hedgerow grew, a thin but visible line that blunted any desire to rehearse the old trespasses. What surprised me most as the dust settled was the ripple effect the incident had on how people thought about boundaries. A neighbor who'd always been reticent about confronting someone now felt empowered to speak up when a contractor from his development started using his shoulder to park. The high school kids who used a trespass through the field for a shortcut suddenly had a route bookmarked and respected more, not out of fear, but from a new clarity about where they could and could not go. My action, theatrical as it was, had reframed the conversation in the valley. Property lines were no longer abstract, they were a visible fact of life. There was, of course, criticism. Some called my method excessive, argued that I'd stooped to petty revenge, or that I'd set a dangerous precedent for others to follow. Those were valid concerns. Any public assertion of ownership can be co-opted by those less scrupulous. That's precisely why I walked the line carefully. A measured response, not cruelty. Still, the question of ethics nagged me. I asked myself if I'd acted out of pride more than principle, if the joy of delivering a humiliating lesson had eclipsed the stoic patience that farm life often demands. Time and the counsel of friends and my wife helped clarify motives. There was pride, yes, but mixed with a protective instinct for the land and for the decency of neighborly engagement. The farm is an inheritance of behavior as much as of acreage. You tend both the soil and the social compacts that let communities survive. One afternoon, months later, Karen returned, not to pick a fight, but to deliver an apology that was awkward and human. She handed me a potted lavender plant, obviously bought at a nursery because it was too pristine to be a product of her own hands. She said she'd been humbled, that being the center of indignation had revealed a brittle core she didn't like. I accepted the plant because it was a gesture of contrition and because farms run on pragmatism more than pride. An apology can be as useful as a fence post if you accept it and move on. We negotiated a truce, formalized by a simple sign paper that promised no more unauthorized parking and a commitment to use mediation rather than confrontation should future disputes arise. It was small, but the law had already established its precedent. The paper made it human. The hedgerow, the sign, the record in the county courthouse, they all stood as reminders that rights come with responsibilities. Beyond the immediate circle of neighbors, the story found its way into conversations at the diner and the feed store. It became shorthand for "don't assume," a tale told by farmers to sons and daughters when teaching the hard lessons about pride, patience, and proportion. That had an unexpected side effect. Younger people reached out to me, asking about land stewardship, asking how to write a deed properly, asking what easement actually meant. The incident had turned into an educational moment, one that helped prevent future misunderstandings simply by clarifying the rules. Sometimes the loudest lessons are those that force people to learn the language of property. I chronicled the events in a journal entry, not as a boast, but as a record, an attempt to translate drama into a lesson. Document everything, keep your deeds handy, and remember that respect is the cheapest way to avoid spectacles. The farmer's life is full of hard work and low drama. The occasional grand gesture is a deviation, not a new normal. I used the publicity to host a small community meeting on land rights that fall, inviting the county clerk and a local mediator to speak. It wasn't a lecture, it was a practical workshop where people could ask about boundaries, easements, and what to do when disputes arise. The turnout surprised me. It wasn't just my neighbors, but people from development communities and a few curious HOA members who wanted to understand the legalities. The meeting reframed the incident as a catalyst for learning rather than simply conflict. That meant more to me than any viral headline. In private moments, I thought about the nature of justice versus spectacle. Sinking the car had been dramatic, yes, but the subsequent steps, the legal filings, the mediated conversation, the educational meeting, were where a real, durable justice was forged. It's like preparing soil for planting. Dramatic action can clear brush, but it's the careful tending afterward that yields harvest. The farm gave me the space to act, the community gave me the context to reflect, and the law gave me the framework to settle. I didn't become a vigilante, and Karen didn't become a martyr. We became neighbors with a shared understanding of where the lane ended and where courtesy began. In the end, the lavender thrived in my yard. It sent a reminder that conflict can lead to growth if handled with a mixture of firmness and humility. Years later, when people ask about the incident, usually at county fairs or when standing in line at the feed store, I tell the story plainly without embellishment. I describe the arrogance of a woman who assumed public dominion, the practicalities of planning a response, the careful limit setting to avoid genuine harm, and the long arc of consequences that turned a moment of indignation into a lesson shared by a community. People chuckle and nod. Some chastise, others clap me on the back, and thank me for saving them the trouble of dealing with petty tyrants. The truth is less about victory and more about the stubbornness required to steward a place. Land expects protection, and protection sometimes requires visible action. The hedgerow still stands taller now, and in late summer when the lavender blooms, it sends up a scent that blends with grass and diesel and the distant laughter of children. Karen moved away 2 years after the incident, her name fading from the area like a footprint in high tide. I learned subsequently that she had a falling out with the HOA board over unrelated matters and decided to sell her property in town. Whether she learned a lasting humility, I can't say, but she left with the memory of a day when a private lane asserted itself against an expectation of command. For me, the event became part of a larger philosophy: act in defense of your domain, but do so with an eye to proportionality and an ear toward reconciliation. I plant boundaries as you plant crops, with patience, effort, and the willingness to tend them until they take root. The excavator that had once transformed a glinting SUV into a lesson is now used for more ordinary work: digging irrigation channels, resetting fence posts, creating habitats for frogs and wildflowers. Its arm bears notches from years of use and a faint trace of the day it made a point. Sometimes I look at it and think about how machinery like law and like language is only a tool. It carries the intent of the hand that operates it. In the long arc, I try to make that intent one of stewardship rather than spectacle. The farm prospers not because of grand gestures, but because of daily diligence: repairing fences, paying taxes, showing up to help a neighbor load hay when winter's first storm threatens. The story's final measure is not who sank a car, but whether the community learned to negotiate boundaries without collapsing into rumor and spite. On quiet evenings, I walk the lane with Gus, who is older now and moves slower, and I tell him the story in the way that keeps it from becoming mythology, with humor, a little regret, and a firm assertion that some things are worth defending. People will always test limits. That's how we learn them. My act was a punctuation, not a sentence. It reminded folks that the land has a grammar of its own: deeds, posts, hedgerows, and the shared understanding that keeps a neighborhood from becoming a battleground. If someone asks for the moral, I say this: defend what you tend, but once you've defended it, teach others why the line matters. Replace spectacle with conversation where you can, and use spectacle only as a last, careful resort. Life on the farm goes on, cycles of seasons turning with the same indifferent patience as the stars. The SUV incident is a chapter in a larger book of stewardship, a moment that taught a few hard lessons and left lavender to bloom on the edge of a lane. That will do for me.